Hi, Brian Lehrer here. Up next, Brian Lehrer Weekend. 3 of our favorite segments from the week packaged together for you to listen to on the weekend. So enjoy, and I'll see you back on the radio Monday at 10 a.m. on WNYC and WNYC.org. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Are you in a union? 10 years ago, that question was mostly for auto workers, teachers, electricians, some others. But something has shifted. It's not just where people are organizing, it's who. When we think of union members, maybe you picture workers on a factory line or longshoremen at a shipping port. But nowadays, union members wear Apple Store T-shirts and white doctors' lab coats. Yes, even some doctors are unionizing. Baristas, video game designers, Hollywood writers, and even resident doctors, yes, have decided to unionize. Noam Scheiber is a labor reporter at the New York Times, and his new book, Mutiny, The Rise and Revolt of the College-Educated Working Class, is about the generation of college graduates who were promised a certain kind of life, or so they thought, didn't get it, and decided to do something about it at work. Noam, it's been a minute. Welcome back to WNYC.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
There are many places we could enter, but let me enter here. You described the first half of 2022 as the most significant moment in U.S. labor history in the last 40 years. Why the first half of 2022?
Yeah, well, we just had this explosion of union organizing among people who didn't typically try to organize a union and at companies that were not unionized. So this kind of starts in the fall of 21, actually, with a few Starbucks stores in Buffalo. And 2 of these 3 stores win. And then that union campaign just spreads like wildfire across the country. First, a half a dozen in January of 22, then a dozen. And then by March, it's literally dozens. And by the end of the year, hundreds are trying to unionize. We have workers at Apple Store, as you mentioned. The first Amazon warehouse in the country was unionized in April of 22. We have workers at Trader Joe's and REI. So we just had this explosion of union activity, again, among people that had not traditionally done this. And so as this was happening kind of in real time, I tried to reach out to people and understand why they were doing this and who they were. And it turned out that a very large number of the people who were doing this were young college grads. They typically had a lot of debt. They were not on the trajectory that they thought that they would be on when they graduated from college. And the pandemic for them was just kind of the breaking point. It was just the last straw after, years of frustrations with their post-college trajectory. So that was really, what caught my attention. And then, kind of stepping back to think about why this happened ultimately led to the book.
Yeah, and to use another historical marker, you use David Brooks' concept of the Bobo. I remember his book, Bobos in Paradise. He was on for that at the time. Bobo, the bourgeois bohemian, as a before picture. And you say this new generation looks similar on the surface, but you write that they have the bank accounts and the politics of the proletariat. First, remind us what the bourgeois bohemian is supposed to mean.
Yeah, so David Brooks wrote this terrific book in 2000 about the bourgeois bohemians, and these were people who were often kind of knowledge workers. They were lawyers and software engineers and management consultants and even tenured professors, and so they had these kind of very intellectually demanding jobs. They were very creative often, but they were not, they were not liberals. They were kind of moderates, third way people in their politics. Was very much in the vein of the sort of late Clinton era. They favored things like trade agreements and globalization and lower taxes and lower regulations. But they also had this sort of bohemian aesthetic. They liked sort of reclaimed wood furniture, and Brooks talks about how they liked sort of nubby fabrics, and so they had this sort of bohemian
Right.
aesthetic, even though they had the kind of politics of the bourgeois.
Alternative in their aesthetics, upper middle class in their political interests.
Exactly, exactly. And so I talk about how this younger generation of college grads, kind of superficially looks like they have some of the tastes and habits of the bourgeois. They have all these fancy devices. They have powerful smartphones. They watch prestige television on demand, but their politics are very, very different from the Bobos. They tend to have pretty far left politics. If you look at polling, the portion of college grads who approve of socialism, it doubles in the 2010s from about 20% to over 40% by the end of the last decade. And so very, very different politics, even though superficially they kind of look, not too different from the Bobos that Brooks was writing about.
So tell our listeners the story in brief of one of your two main characters. You have Teddy, a Grinnell grad who ended up organizing a Starbucks in Chicago, and Shia, am I saying her name right?
Yeah, Kaya Barrett. So yeah, Kaya Barrett is a fascinating person. She grew up in Baltimore County, and her parents had gone to college, but not graduated from college. But college was very, very important to them, and they really emphasized the importance of going to college to their children, including Kaya. Kaya went to a predominantly black high school in Baltimore County, but again, college was extremely important. Kaya talks about how every year the seniors were told to put their acceptance letters, to tape them to the office window of her high school because they wanted to sort of celebrate all the students who were going to college. Kaya ends up going to Towson University in Maryland, a pretty good state school in Maryland. She studies communications. In college, she works part-time at an Apple store, and she loves Apple. She's kind of a self-described Apple nerd who's been super into Apple gadgets since she was a little girl. So she loves this job as a college job, but she thinks that she is going to get a job, kind of a grown-up job in her mind. So she applies to dozens of jobs in kind of marketing, communications, professional development, doesn't get any of those jobs. So finally, when she graduates in 2018, she ends up just taking her college job as a full-time job. And that is a bit disappointing, but Apple had been a place that had traditionally been like a pretty good resting spot for college grads who did not kind of end up in a job that required a degree. So Kaya actually got a job called a creative, and these are the people at Apple stores who kind of teach classes. They, may help you edit a video that you made on your computer or help you edit a podcast. And so this was a kind of sought after job. But the problem was, in addition to these broader forces that I'm writing about, higher unemployment among college grads, rising debt, Apple itself was kind of degrading this creative job. And so it used to be this sort of high status job within Apple. But by the time Kaya got there, it was already sort of losing some of its luster. And then over the next few years, Apple actually starts rolling back some of these classes that the creatives taught and just pulling them onto the sales floor to sell, iPhones and Macs. And Kaya is just getting extremely frustrated, thinking like, okay, it was already a compromise that I ended up taking my college job as a grown-up job, but now I'm not even doing the job that was described. It was supposed to be this sort of elevated, something that wasn't just ordinary retail. But now increasingly, I'm just selling iPhones like everybody else in the store, and that was really frustrating for her.
Listeners, does this sound like you and your workplace? Do you want to tell us a story? Are you in a traditionally unorganized sector that's been unionizing in recent years? Maybe you and your colleagues are considering a union. Help us report this story. Call or text 212-433 WNYC 212-433-9692 for New York Times labor reporter Noam Scheiber, who's got this new book, Mutiny, The Rise and Revolt of the College-Educated Working Class. Here's a text that's come in already, Noam. It says, I'm waiting for freelancers to actually unionize because the massive rise in gig workers, at least in creative industries, has been a complete detriment because once a freelancer's rate is set, it's almost impossible to increase it despite years of increased inflation. Do you write about freelancers in the book?
I don't write a ton about freelancers. I have written about them in the past, but I do think this dovetails with actually a broader trend that we see at these companies, which is the rise of contractors, temps, contingent workers. So 20 years ago or 25 years ago, when Steve Jobs created the Apple Store, he was very adamant that we had to have employees, we had to, extensively train them, we wanted to give them good benefits because we knew that if they were happy and they felt good about their relationship to Apple, then they would in turn make customers feel really good about the product and the company. And so that was the kind of founding principle of the Apple Store. But over the past 15 years or so, under Tim Cook, the company has gradually relied more and more on this sort of contingent labor force. They hire a lot of temps, especially in the fall and through the holidays when, they release new iPhones. And obviously there's a lot of business in around the holidays. And so now you get this kind of labor force that sort of waxes and wanes as needed. And these are temps. They don't get the same benefits. They don't get the same training. And it really is kind of like hiring freelancers. The company doesn't feel the same responsibility and relationship that they do to their permanent employees. And so what the person who wrote the text is describing, I think, is actually very true of freelancers, but it's something we've broadly seen in corporate America, where we've gone to kind of more of a freelance, contingent gig working workforce. And that's one of the things that I think has really increased the level of frustration. It's created this sense of precariousness that workers feel like they just never know if they're going to get enough hours to pay their bills. They don't know if they're going to have health care. And so that's very central to the story that I tell in the book.
Here's Daniel in Manhattan calling in, who I think identified very much with the story of the woman Kaya from your book, whose story you were telling before. Daniel, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi. I wanted to Kaya. I can't believe Kaya's story because I had the same experience graduating college, working as a family room specialist at Apple, which was also supposed to be an elevated role, but in 2009 during the housing crisis when I graduated college. But I want to say it gets better. I leveraged that job into a support role at a big tech company and then moved into a product job at that same tech company and then had a sort of a pretty serious career after that. So it gets a little bit easier.
Daniel, thank you. Noah? Did he get the point?
So I think one interesting development of the past 20, 25 years or so that I've flickered in the book is there used to be a class of jobs that you might call them like good non-college jobs. So people would graduate from college. Maybe they didn't end up with the job that they really wanted, that they, in the field that they majored in, but they got a job that was pretty good. It was, relatively interesting, pretty good paying. These are jobs like insurance agents or real estate brokers or a lot of people in HR or office managers. The jobs didn't require a degree, but a lot of college graduates did them and they paid them pretty well. And what we see from data from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is that right around 2003, those good paying non-degree jobs start to go away, and then they really collapse in the recession in 2008-9, and then they just never come back. And so this thing that had been a kind of safety valve, good non-college jobs, you can think of certain jobs at the Apple Store as these jobs, they had really been a way for people who, again, didn't get their first choice job, but to, make a good enough living and have a good enough job that kept them engaged. This, over the past 20 years, we've really seen these erode and disappear, and that's left people, in some cases in the situation that the first person who wrote the text was in, in more in a freelancing kind of job or a gig kind of job, or just taking, a kind of more traditional retail or customer service or hospitality restaurant industry job. And so I think that's been, kind of one of the underappreciated stories of the past 25 years that, has reinforced the frustration among these graduates.
Well, here's kind of a pushback text reacting to your Kaya story. Listener writes, can you explain how a union could help someone like Kaya and her predicament? I'm losing the practical element, person writes, of why someone would want to unionize and what the union could actually accomplish, particularly for a company who has the right to restructure and reorganize. Interesting, right?
Yeah, so I think it's a very fair point and very important to point out, some of the pluses and minuses. So the union that Kaya and her coworkers organized at the Apple store in Towson, it took them a long time, over a year, almost a year and a half to negotiate a contract. They finally did. They got raises that amounted to about 10% for the typical worker over 3 years. And to your caller's point, this is nothing special at Apple. Apple can then turn around and just give every employee at every retail store who's not in a union the same 10% raise. So in a way, you could argue that these folks are just kind of running to stand still. They're just running in place. They put a lot of effort into this union, and they got basically what Apple could turn around and give every other Apple employee. But there are a few wrinkles, I think, that actually make it a little more complicated of a story and maybe, demonstrate that there is some value to unionizing. And one specific provision of the contract at Towson was that the store could never have more temps than 25% of the full-time employees. So if there are
Uh-huh.
100 full-time or 100 permanent employees at the store, they could have no more than 25 temps at any given time. And this was really important because, as I said, over the past 10 years or so, Apple has relied on more and more temporary and kind of seasonal workers and fewer permanent workers. And so I think the workers at that store really felt like this kind of shift to temps was eroding, and kind of moving in on the jobs that they had traditionally had. And so even though, they didn't necessarily get a bigger wage bump or a bigger bump in benefits, they got certain protections like that cap on temps that really made them feel better about the stability and reliability of their jobs. And there are a few other provisions like that in the contract that I think, don't get the same headlines as a big wage increase, but really do
Hmm.
give workers peace of mind that they didn't have before.
Really interesting. By the way, reacting to the freelancer who wrote in, some other people are writing in with advice, I guess, or examples of things that do exist. One says there's been an artists guild in New York City for years. I was a member as an illustrator in Manhattan. Another just says, please let your listeners know about
Yep.
freelancersunion.org. We've had guests from there in the past,
Yes. Yep.
freelancersunion.org. So that's a thing that the listener who wrote in or others could contact and see if what they do specifically is relevant to your work. A few more minutes with Noam Scheiber, labor reporter for the New York Times, with his new book, Mutiny, The Rise and Revolt of the College-Educated Working Class. And one of the chapters in your book is dedicated to a union tactic called salting.
Hmm.
The main salt in your story is somebody named Jazz Brissac, if I'm saying that right, a Rhodes
Correct. Yep.
Scholar who went straight from that at Oxford to a Starbucks in Buffalo. So what is salting, and what did that look like in Jazz's case at Starbucks in Buffalo?
Yeah, so salting is a kind of tradition, a labor organizing tradition that dates back more than 100 years. And the idea is to kind of go undercover as an organizer. So you had people, usually with kind of left-wing politics, who decide that they wanted to go and help organize workers. So they would get hired, as a truck driver or a factory worker. And the key to salting is to be a really good worker. So you come in, you roll up your sleeves, you work really hard, you establish yourself as a good worker, and then you kind of very discreetly start talking to your coworkers after earning their trust about the potential of unionizing. So this was a tradition again that dates back to the early 20th century. It had gone kind of out of fashion, or just sort of been a lost art, for many decades. But it starts to kind of come back a bit in the 90s. And then in the last decade or so, I think there's been a renewed push for it. And I think in line with some of these trends that I alluded to, just a kind of growing interest among college grads in socialism and left-wing politics since the Great Recession. And so Jazz was someone who did incredibly well in school. They graduated from the University of Mississippi. They won a Rhodes Scholarship. They went to study intellectual history at Oxford, but their real passion was organizing. So they came back to Buffalo. They actually were involved in organizing a local coffee chain that they succeeded in doing, and then they kind of set their sights on this, on the whale, of the industry, which was Starbucks. And so, Jazz gets hired in, let's let's see, it would have been December of 2020, and goes, essentially undercover at Starbucks while working with a union in the area called Workers United. Goes about it the way that Salt's had been doing for decades. Works really hard, establishes themselves as a good employee, starts making connections with other workers, and ultimately persuades them to join in this unionization effort. And but I want to say that I think this salting effort was very important to getting the union campaign at Starbucks off the ground in Buffalo. But after that, what was interesting is that it spread extremely organically. There were not salts at all these other locations around the country. It was just people in their stores in Chicago, in Boston, in Phoenix, looking at what happened at the stores in Buffalo and deciding that they wanted to do it on their own. So they would just kind of jump on a Zoom with the people in Buffalo. People in Buffalo would kind of send them a little instruction manual and checklist, and they would be off to the races. So while this thing was sort of set in motion by a very dedicated salting effort, it actually spreads incredibly organically. And that's actually what led me to write the book. I sort of, as this was happening in 22, I was wondering, okay, how is this thing spreading so quickly to dozens and then hundreds of stores? And it turned out that it was these sort of, downwardly mobile college grads who just had a real hunger to do this once they saw it. Kind of proof of concept in Buffalo.
By the way, a little more pushback on that Apple anecdote that you gave. Listener writes, isn't that Apple store one of the ones that Apple is closing because it is unionizing?
Yeah, so it is illegal to close a store because it unionized. That's directly a violation of the National Labor Relations Act. But it is, I would say the timing is suspect. Apple closes very, very few stores. It's only closed a small handful over the years, and it did announce recently that it closed the Towson store. I think the union, I think they're unsure of how they're going to respond. But it is entirely possible that this will get litigated, as a violation of law if Apple can't demonstrate that there were other reasons for closing the store. So this is like very actively contested or being looked into at the moment.
Listener writes, for decades, the architectural industry has been really harsh on their workers. Long hours, low pay, considering what another profession can make within the same amount of hours. Have any architectural unions popped up? Do you happen to know about that, professional class and unions?
Absolutely, yes. Very glad you asked. I've written about union campaigns among architects, and the writer is exactly right. For decades, this was very much a non-unionized workforce. These are folks who go to school for a very long time. They come out with a ton of debt. They're incredibly skilled, but they work very long hours for low pay. You get often 60, 70 hours a week, but no overtime. And so yes, beginning in 22, I think there began to be some organizing campaigns at some very prominent architecture firms in New York City. There's actually one that succeeded. It was called Bernheimer and Associates. It's a smaller architecture firm, but that was the first private sector architecture firm that we know of, and at least I think there were some maybe in the 30s that were unionized, but in many, many decades, Bernheimer was the first private sector firm that unionized. There have been a few others. I wrote a piece a couple months ago about a firm called Snøhetta, which is a very prominent, highly respected firm. There was an organizing campaign there. The union lost by just a couple of votes, and then there was actually a group of people involved in the campaign who Snøhetta laid off. Snøhetta said it had nothing to do with the union, but the union filed what's known as a charge with the National Labor Relations Board, and the board then issued a complaint saying that these people were basically retaliated against for trying to unionize. So that's still being litigated. But yes, this is a very active area of organization, and our architects are really in some ways kind of very much fit the profile of the person I'm writing about. Very skilled, a lot of debt, and very tough working conditions. And I think in the last 5-10 years, architects have really been radicalized. One
more. Doctors. You write in the book about doctors forming unions. I think a lot of people listening will still think, really? Doctors in a union?
Yeah, no, doctors is a fascinating case. I actually First wrote about a group of doctors unionizing in Oregon at a medical system there called Peace Health in 2015. And this was, so far as I could tell, the first group of private sector doctors to organize in the country for at least decades and possibly forever. Certainly, we've had doctors who work for cities, hospitals, and state hospitals in the public sector unionized. But this, I think, was the first group in the private sector in 2015. And then, in the last few years, we've seen a huge increase. There was a big union campaign at a health system in Minnesota called Alina, where in early 23, about 100 hospital doctors, known as hospitalists, unionized. And then in the fall, 400 primary care doctors unionized, which was the biggest private sector union of doctors we've ever seen. And what's really interesting about doctors is, as you say, we think of doctors as these highly skilled, highly trained professionals. Typically they would own their own practice. They would kind of be the boss. But in the past 15, 20 years, we've just seen this huge consolidation in the healthcare industry. And so doctors who for generations had been, their own boss. Maybe they had a relationship with a hospital and they had privileges, but they basically called the shots. Over the past 15, 20 years, they've become the employees. And I think what you've seen is a lot of frustration, them thinking that, the MBAs and the bean counters who run these health systems are suddenly telling them what to do, how long they can spend with their patients, what they have to ask them, how long they can keep them in the hospital. And so there's just been this huge backlash to that, which I think has driven a lot of the organizing among doctors.
By the way, and you'll have to keep this really short, is there any implications from this for national politics? If the former college-educated bourgeoisie is now increasingly the college-educated working class, it's already college-educated people who are the core of the Democratic Party's voters. So does this change national politics in any respect when we think about midterm congressional elections, 2028 presidential? Do you think, real quick?
I do, yeah. I actually talk about this in the final chapter in the epilogue of my book. And you're absolutely right. It used to be in the 80s and 90s that college grads were to the right of working class people on economics. But since about 2004, we've seen them drift left and kind of, really favor higher taxes, more regulation, more of a government role. And I do think that there is this potential coalition, of college grads and non-college folks who could come together and, form a kind of supermajority on economic issues. And the one example I would point to, perhaps not surprisingly, is the mayor, Zoran Mamdani, who really did kind of, talk very extensively about economic issues and affordability. And if you look at the way the college-educated folks voted for in this election, 84% of college grads under 30 voted for Mamdani, even though, he's a self-described democratic socialist. And a generation earlier, you would have never seen college grads do that. So I think it is really striking to see, the potential coalition that someone like Mamdani flicked at in his campaign.
Noam Scheiber, New York Times labor reporter, focusing on white-collar workers, and now the author of Mutiny, The Rise and Revolt of the College-Educated Working Class. Thanks for an interesting conversation, Noam. Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
This isn't normal. This isn't right.
On a picturesque Danish dairy farm,
the cows refused to drink.
we heard of strange goings-on.
When she was near the barn, she had detected this
horrible energy
that was coursing through the farm.
I need to get out of here.
This farm's possessed.
I didn't know what I would find when I went out to the barn.
But then we also heard how none of this is really happening.
The Resistance of a Cow from Radiolab. Get it wherever you get podcasts.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. If you've been to a fast food restaurant in New York City recently, you may have noticed a little triangle on the menu next to certain items. Some have a salt shaker, others have a tablespoon of sugar. Those are warning labels indicating a dish has more sodium or added sugar than you should probably eat in an entire day. New York City implemented the country's first added sugars warning labels at chain restaurants last October. Meanwhile, the sodium warning labels were adopted back in 2015. Now, the health commissioner who oversaw the city's rollout of sodium warning labels is arguing for a set of bills that state lawmakers are considering that would put similar warning labels on junk food at chain restaurants across the state and limit how that food is marketed to kids. 3 bills. They're called the Sodium Warning Bill, the Sweet Truth Act, and the Predatory Marketing Prevention Act. And with me now to make the case for these bills is Dr. Mary Bassett, public health physician, former New York City Health Commissioner and New York State Health Commissioner, and professor of practice of health and human rights at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Bassett, always good to talk. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thanks very much for having me, Brian. Pleasure to be here.
By way of background, you were the New York City Health Commissioner when the city rolled out sodium warning labels back in 2015, the first policy of its kind in the country, I believe. So what does the city already have, and how would the sodium warning bill go further?
Well, of course, New York City has long pioneered giving people more information about the food that they eat in fast food chains. That began with the calorie posting. That was back in 2006 under Tom Frieden and the Bloomberg administration, and followed later in terms of warning labels with a sodium warning label that you've just described. So New York City has done both of these things, warned about added sugar and warned about the added sodium in our diets. Both of these are important drivers of what we call diet-related diseases. They drive overweight, obesity, diabetes. They drive high blood pressure, dental decay, which having dental caries has broader effects than just ruining your teeth. So these are important health issues and ones that are preventable. And that's why I'm very much hoping that the state acts to take these out of committee and bring the information that New York City residents already have to the rest of the state. Now, the predatory marketing bill really is an ambitious and important bill because it talks about how children are targeted, not just on television and in stores, but on social media, and encouraged to badger their parents for food. And this would empower the Attorney General to take actions to protect children from marketing foods directly to them that aren't good for them.
And we'll talk about that in some more detail as we go. But listeners, do you pay attention to warning or nutrition labels on packaged foods or in restaurants? If not, why not? Or do you have a question or a comment on the 3 bills now before the New York State Legislature that our guest, the former Health Commissioner Mary Bassett, is advocating for? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. You can call or you can text. Again, they are the Sodium Warning Bill, the Sweet Truth Act, and the Predatory Marketing Prevention Act. I want to get into whether these warning labels have any effect. I do see a 2023 study in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine found that added sugar warning labels reduce the likelihood that consumers would order high sugar items. But I also see that earlier real-world studies of New York City's sodium label found limited changes in what people actually ordered. So to what extent do you think these warning labels really change our habits?
Well, the first thing to say about these is that having information is part of being a good democracy. If people don't have the information, they have no opportunity to use it. So I don't think that it's necessary to prove that there's a direct health impact, to argue that we should provide this information so that people can use it. It's available to them. And as you point out, the information has been mixed. There has been some evidence that the sodium warning labels have driven down rates of high blood pressure, and there's some evidence that, and this would include calorie posting, that people just go ahead and order what they usually order without paying attention to this. But the point here is that information enables people to use it, and without it, they don't even have that opportunity.
So let me ask you about why the sodium bill hasn't passed yet, because I see that it's been introduced in Albany every session since 2015 and hasn't passed. Who fights effectively against it? Is there a lobby group for big sodium?
Well, I don't know the specifics for the New York Act, but I can tell you that my experience in New York City is that big food is quite an adversary, much more powerful and with much more resources at their disposal than big tobacco. And they fought New York City on every single one of these bills. So, I expect that the basis of their contention will be much as it always was, that you're making us say things we don't want to say, and the other, that the federal guidance is enough for people. So I think that in general, the food industry has resisted these, and of course, predatory marketing would be a truly pioneering act, and I expect that would be contested. So while I can't tell you exactly what has happened in the New York State legislature, I would assume it's the same dynamics.
So you don't have a take on whether this year might be politically different to allow it to pass?
I would hope it is, because it's the right thing to do for public health. I mean, I think the measure that we should all use is whether these measures would advance public health, and it takes time. It took a while for the added sugar to be made into law in New York City. The state has the city to use as an example. It's not as though fast food chains have been driven out of business. So I'm hopeful that the legislature will act in the interests of New Yorkers. And I guess we haven't really mentioned this, but the adverse impact of too much salt, too much sugar, have been disproportionate. And that's why I wrote the letter to the caucuses of Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic.
I was just going to ask you about that, because, yes, your letter was to the Black, Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and Asian Legislative Caucus, urging them to prioritize this package of bills. So take us a little bit more into that, why it would be a particular public health interest to them.
Well, because of the excess burden of these preventable chronic diseases that are diet-related among people of color. So, for example, Black, Latino, and Asian New Yorkers are about twice as likely to have diabetes as white New Yorkers. So diabetes is too common, and it's become increasingly common, driven largely by the obesity epidemic, but it's disproportionately occurs among Blacks and Latinos. So that's why I'm hoping that these representatives, mindful of their constituencies and their obligation to protect them, will seize the moment and take these bills out of committee.
Do you have a take as a public health expert on why those diseases are more prevalent in those communities?
Well, there's a really substantially disproportionate marketing of these foods in these communities. When you think about it, fast food is often a good buy on a per calorie basis. There was a researcher at the University of Washington, and I right now I just can't recall his name, but he told me made the statement that if you look at the weight distribution of your workforce, I'll tell you if they are making a living wage. So for low-income individuals, fast food may be a good buy. And people are not only pressed for money, they're pressed for time. And fast food is also, quick and easy after a long day to come home with already prepared food is increasingly a way people eat. We eat over half of our calories are from processed and prepared foods. So it's not only that it saves money, it saves time, and disproportionately, these are factors that drive the lives of people of color.
Listeners, who has a story about helping your kids read nutrition labels and warning labels when they go out to restaurants, especially fast food restaurants? Here's a text, folks. Listener writes, I agree with your guest that the information... that's the wrong text. I'll read that one in a minute. Listener writes, both of my son's 7th grade science teachers spent one class discussing food labels, ingredients, and expiration dates, and it made them and me aware of these things forever, writes Louise in Manhattan. So what about you, listeners? Because so much of this is aimed at children, as we've been discussing. Do you educate your kids about warning labels, about nutrition labels? 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Call or text, in addition to how they affect your own behavior, as we continue with Dr. Mary Bassett, the former health commissioner of New York City and New York State, now at the Harvard School of Public Health, as she advocates for 3 bills in front of the New York State Legislature: the Sodium Warning Bill, the Sweet Truth Act, and the Predatory Marketing Prevention Act. Dr. Bassett, here's that other text. Listener writes, I agree with your guest that the information should be available. However, who bears the cost of analyzing all these menu items?
Well, these data were already available when I was commissioner. They just weren't readily accessible to the public. And the reason that these bills, the Sweet Truth Act and the Sodium Warning Bill, focus on food chains, is that they use standardized recipes. So they already know the composition of their food and its calorie content. And so it was simply a matter of directing them to make it publicly available. So this is something that the companies already do. This is not, I don't know I wouldn't begin to be able to measure the calorie content of what I cook at home, but these are standardized recipes.
Sharon in New Rochelle, you're on WNYC with Dr. Bassett. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. A couple of questions. One is, despite somewhat weak evidence on showing consumer purchasing habits with labeling, my understanding is that industry formulations have changed somewhat, and I have a second question.
Yeah, no.
Which is, I think England has been trying a 10-year plan of reducing sodium in the food system. It was kind of voluntary. I'm wondering if you know anything about the outcome of that.
Well, thanks for pointing that out, and I should have mentioned it, that certainly when the calorie information first came out, some of the offerings, they really had sticker shock, and they reformulated. I remember in particular Starbucks reformulated some of its very caloric pastries, and the hope is always that there will be reformulation. There was a large effort in the UK to limit the amount of sodium in processed and prepared foods. In the UK, a big source of sodium in the diet was from bread, for example. And they worked with the industry, and New York City undertook the same kind of effort. I don't know where it stands now, to say that within a sector, all of you should be able to lower the sodium content of your food, and the one with the lowest sodium should set the goal for everybody else. So there was an industry effort to participate in this. I think we shouldn't assume that industry wants people to become obese or have high blood pressure. So the UK example was a very important example. Finland also managed to greatly reduce the sodium content of its food. We can do this. And just giving people the information is a pretty modest first step towards thinking about how we think about the safety of our food.
Sharon, thanks for your call. We've been talking mostly about the warning label bills, right, for sugar and for sodium, but I want to make sure we give a few minutes to the third in this trio of bills that you're advocating for, the Predatory Marketing Prevention Act. Because I could argue that this would be more important than the product labeling ones, because labeling puts responsibility on the individual when what would really matter is something more structural to limit the power of the fast food or processed food industry with all its saturation, advertising, and marketing clout that you referred to before. Do you think of this at all in that way?
Yes, absolutely. And I think of it as as a good thing to have sodium information and the added sugar information, but this would really be an important way of protecting our children. Remember that people's eating habits are established fairly early in life, and so from early childhood, kids are bombarded with messages about fast foods and encouraged to pester their parents to consume, to let them eat fast foods. And this is disproportionately targeting black children, is what I have the data on, who are exposed to 75% more fast food ads than white children. So I think empowering the Attorney General to address this deceptive youth-targeted marketing and hold companies accountable would be a terrific step forward in having a safer food supply.
Listener writes, when shopping, I noticed this subset of shoppers who are very careful to purchase what they consider healthy. Regardless of the contents, a green box is selected, almost too easy for evil junk food marketers. Any education, including labels, may help. Is that an aspect of predatory marketing that the bill would get to at all? Deceptive labeling to make things look healthy, including green-colored boxes when the contents really aren't?
That's interesting. I hadn't heard about just the color being deceptive. That might be a hard one to make the case for, but certainly the Attorney General would be empowered to interpret deceptive, and to take the companies to task, and I think we all remember when the front of package labeling was all 100% trans fat free when it was full of added sugars, sort of using labeling to portray it as a healthful product when the product was not.
Well,
that
we
healthy.
still probably have that with organic, for example, right? Something might have an organic label, but still have a lot of organically grown sugar and salt.
Right. Exactly. And so I think that this. I think it would be a really good foray. I'm sure it would be challenged in the courts, but it's time to start thinking about what it means to protect our food. And for, decades, this meant making sure that the additives were safe or that it wasn't contaminated with bacteria. But now we have to think about, there being too much sugar, too much salt, too much of it, too caloric. And that should go into how we think about the safety of our food in modern times.
One more call. Anna in Chelsea. You're on WNYC with former New York City and New York State Health Commissioner Dr. Mary Bassett. Hi, Anna.
Hi. Thank you so much for both of you for this conversation, all your work, both of you. Big fans of both of you. I just want to say I run a health literacy nonprofit that's based in New York City. And one of the things that we talk about with our frontline health and social service professionals is how hard it is for just a regular person with kind of average literacy skills to be able to enact their low sodium diet, to find sodium on a food label, to be able to interpret how much it is, to be able to guess how much sodium they've already had, how much they can have in this one helping. Like, these are complicated literacy skills people need to be able to read food labels and apply them to their lives. And I think that there is so much more that can be done on the food supply side to make things easier for people to make healthy choices. And so I super applaud these bills as a step to that.
Anna, thank you very much.
Yes.
Last thought, Dr. Bassett, then we're out of time.
Well, just to point out that the recommended intake of sodium is about a teaspoon of salt. So just keep that in mind, that about a teaspoon of salt and
per day.
And I'll leave it at that. These are things that are best addressed, as you suggested, Brian, by reformulation. But in the meantime, let's at least give people information.
Dr. Mary Bassett, public health physician, former New York City and New York State health commissioner, and professor of practice of health and human rights at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She's been here to advocate for 3 bills before the New York State Legislature: the Sodium Warning Bill, the Sweet Truth Act, and the Predatory Marketing Prevention Act. Thank you so much for coming on again, Dr. Bassett.
Thanks for having me.
Hungary's newly elected prime minister praised the independent media outlet that launched his political rise. He called it
a channel that filled the gap for public media when public media was propaganda.
Peter Magyar vows to free up the media and will likely succeed, because the bar's so low.
You're being compared to Viktor Orban. You can only be great for the press.
On the next On the Media from WNYC. Find On the Media wherever you get your podcasts.
Lehrer on WNYC. Now we'll talk about a bill in the New York City Council that would regulate last-mile delivery companies, those subcontractors that Amazon and other retail companies use to get packages to your door. Supporters of the proposed legislation say workers employed by these subcontractors are being pushed into dangerous conditions by unrealistic quotas, and that the streets are getting less safe as a result. They also say that Amazon has structured things specifically so it doesn't have to answer for any of it. It's called the Delivery Protection Act, and it would require those operators to be licensed by the city, meet basic safety and labor standards, and hold parent companies responsible when things go wrong, rather than letting them hide behind the subcontracting arrangement. Besides the city council member, the Teamsters Union, which represents Amazon employees, is very behind this bill. Council member Tiffany Caban of Queens, District 22, that's Astoria, Jackson Heights, East Elmhurst, Woodside, Rikers Island, is the lead sponsor, and we'll talk to her about what she's proposing. We'll also spend a few minutes talking about some other issues in local politics, including some thoughts from her about Mayor Zohran Mamdani's first 100 days in office. Councilmember, welcome back to WNYC.
Thanks for having me. Always great.
And listeners, we want to hear from you. Help us report the core story here. If you drive for a last-mile delivery subcontractor, we especially want your voice in this conversation. What are conditions actually like for you in that job? Do you have quotas? Do you feel protected? What changes would you like to see to the system that you work inside of? 212-433 WNYC, or anyone else may call, anyone from the, Amazon corporate hierarchy, Mr. Bezos, you can call in, or anybody else. 212-433 WNYC, 433-9692, call or text. So, council member, let's start with the basic problem you're trying to solve. When you order something from Amazon or sometimes other companies, who actually delivers it?
Yeah. So you mentioned Amazon, but the industry is basically controlled by 3 big companies. 90% is Amazon, UPS, FedEx. 10% are some smaller companies. But, using that Amazon example, you might have a driver that's wearing an Amazon vest, driving an Amazon van, delivering an Amazon package, who ultimately does not technically work for Amazon, despite the fact that they're setting the routes, the quotas, and really dictating the behavior on the job. And so when things go wrong because of that behavior that's being set down through Amazon policy and orders, then they say, well, you can't hold us accountable. So what we're seeing, or what we're trying to solve for, is first and foremost a public safety issue. This is an industry that is growing exponentially, and it's virtually unregulated. We're seeing 3 million packages being delivered every single day just in New York City. We're anticipating 1 billion this year. And what that's come along with is a 137% increase in truck-related crashes near last mile facilities. And it's also coming along with an employee injury rate that's 3 times the national average for private employers. So it is an unsafe, exploitative industry. And in order to make it safer for everybody, for people who are navigating our streets, for people who are the workers delivering the package, we have to get to the root. And right now we can't because of the sort of like the subcontracting model where they put all the liability on these small DSPs and leave them holding the bag, and they can just cut them off whenever they see fit.
I sometimes see unmarked cars, just what look like plain, individually owned cars, not labeled Amazon or any other company, park on the block where my building and other buildings are, and somebody comes out of the car and is delivering some packages to the lobbies. Is that sometimes an Amazon deliverer or a deliverer for other companies that, they have famous names, but the cars aren't marked?
Yeah. So are you talking about cars or vans? Because if you're seeing sort of personal looking vehicles, that is the Amazon Flex model. And so that operates, and it's much, much smaller than the subset of workers that we're talking about. And that operates more like a gig model. And so it does not fall under this bill.
I see. But these subcontractors that Amazon calls delivery service partners, that's what allows Amazon to say, not our problem when something goes wrong. Is that basically the issue?
Yes. So I'm going to lay it out for you, right? And it's the key to this, exploitative industry. The vast majority of Amazon packages, for example, using this easy example, are the delivery service providers. So these facilities, they churn through working class New Yorkers, injuring them, pushing them beyond what any workers should face, just to enrich people like Jeff Bezos, who, if you want to call, my guy, just give us a call. We'd love to talk to you. But it exploits these DSP owners because there's a really disturbing report that was in Motherboard about the toll that this model has taken on DSP owners that kind of bears out the exploitation. So companies like Amazon, they displace all of their insurance, the repair costs, the debt, et cetera, onto these smaller companies. And it allows them, the parent company, to reap maximum profits while letting the owners of these subcontractors shoulder the risks. So we've heard stories of people who started these DSPs thinking it would be an opportunity to become entrepreneurs, but as soon as something goes sideways, Amazon cuts off the contract and leaves the owner saddled with debt, putting workers out of a job. If the workers decide that they want to organize at a DSP and unionize, Amazon pretty much immediately cuts the contract with that DSP. We just recently had the bill heard in the city council, and we heard from a former DSP owner, this guy named David, who went out of business because he closed his business. He didn't sell it. He closed it because he said, this is completely unsustainable. It was either choose to stay profitable or make my workers unsafe. And he couldn't do both. And he said, well, I'm not going to do this. And so the only people this model really works for are the executives of parent companies like Amazon.
Why would their workers not be safe? Is it because of what your press release calls unrealistic delivery quotas?
Absolutely. Like I said, and this is coming into the pandemic, the way that consumers buy products has just really shifted. I think at the hearing, we heard that 1 in every 3 people in New York get a delivery daily. And ultimately, right, the last mile delivery facility, that's the last stop before that package gets from, the person you bought it from to your door. And the quotas are getting higher and higher and higher. So when you see these vans parked in the middle of the street or in a bike lane or blocking a hydrant, those are unsafe practices that are being you're being shepherded into them because of these high quotas. You're supposed to get 30 minutes for lunch and 2 15-minute breaks, but in order to make your quota, you end up skipping those breaks. We've heard horrific stories of, Amazon workers urinating in bottles to make their quotas, it's a model that incentivizes a race to the bottom, and that's where you see the increase in crashes. But we're also seeing a proliferation of pollution in certain areas. So we want these employers to be good partners to our community and to make sure that we're keeping people safe. And if they don't reach the quota, and if they refuse to engage in these unsafe practices, well, the next day they might not have a route there for them, and so it's really a matter of survival for these drivers, and they're sort of forced to make these impossible decisions.
I think John in Westfield is going to say one of his family members had a job like this. Hi, John, you're on WNYC.
Yes, hi, Brian. Yes, my daughter took the job. She was really excited about it and had all of the, the rules. She looked at them very, very strictly and followed them. And make a long story short, by following the rules, she couldn't make quota and was terminated. That happens, and it happened to her. She's since then got another job, but she was pretty upset about that because she really tried.
Could you give us a little more on that? Like, what was the quota? Why was it hard to meet? Did it cause her to drive in certain ways or anything else?
Well, it didn't cause her to drive. That's the point. Basically, I believe the quota was she needed to make 40 deliveries, and to take take a picture with the right format to prove delivery. You couldn't have when you took the photo, you couldn't have like the street number in the photo. There were some conditions there, but really it was how to drive, where to park. All of that, the speed, follow, never go above the speed limit, which most people seem to do. She followed the rules, and it didn't work for her.
40 deliveries in what, a kind of 8-hour workday?
Yes.
John, thank you for sharing that story. What were you thinking listening to it, council member?
I mean, it's a lot of what we have heard, and I know that the quotas are much, much higher in really high volume areas. And the fact is that, to his point, he said it didn't work out for his daughter because if you decide to be safe above all else, and then you don't hit that quota, you can forget about having a route the next day. And, it goes beyond even just the pace, but also because a lot of these DSPs aren't getting the help from Amazon and they're undercapitalized. They're working with these vans and they don't want to ground them, right? Because you ground them, you lose time, you don't make your quota. And so I've had workers send me videos and pictures of vans being held together with tape, doors falling off. I've heard about vans' transmissions going out on the highway and feeling really unsafe, really worn brake pads. The maintenance isn't there because the model doesn't create a situation where the money is there to do that sort of thing. And so we hear that a lot. And a personal story I'll give, which is part of the reason why I started thinking about this bill when I first got into office, was my dad he's retired now, but he was an elevator mechanic. And he had to do those, among other things, those safety inspections of the elevators. You see the little paper in the elevator last time he was inspected. And early on when he was on the job, he had gotten a quota to do these inspections, and it was way too many of them that he could do in a period of time. And so his supervisors was like, basically telling him, cut corners. You can skip through some stuff. And my dad was like, no, this is heavy machinery. I'm not going to cut corners. And ultimately, he was retaliated against and almost lost his job. And the reason why he kept his job is because his union fought for him. And so these are things that we see in different industries. And this is a particular industry where, like I said, it's grown so fast that it's like the Wild West. There are basically no regulations right now. And it's our responsibility as government officials to do that to keep people safe.
Listener writes in a text message, the pressure on the delivery drivers is so great that in my case, at least, they leave packages on the street with photos where they disappear or toss them down a next door alley with a locked gate or lie and say package was delivered and I signed for it. All the while I'm upstairs, no one is buzzed, no package. I don't like to complain to Amazon even though I will get a refund because I know Amazon will lower the boom on the driver, but I paid for the package. So that's one listener. The Amazon submitted formal testimony against the bill for your hearing last week. Their argument as I understand it, isn't really about subcontracting as a principle. It's that the bill would threaten their delivery partners, these contractors, and put thousands of workers out of a job. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing a multi-million-dollar misinformation campaign by opponents of the bill, including Amazon. Amazon is paying tens of thousands of dollars to a PR firm to run a spin campaign. They are part of a main opposition group coalition that they're backing that is running TV ads with misinformation. And also, they got into the sweepstakes business recently. They said they put out this email and this ad to delivery drivers saying, hey, you have a chance to win $1,000 cash from us if you just send us a video telling us how much you love your job. And the best 100 will get that $1,000, and the best 10 will get a $5,000 all expense paid vacation. Those are the kinds of things we're seeing. And oftentimes we will see from these multi-million-dollar companies that oppose regulation because regulations cut into their billion and billion-dollar profits at the expense of worker safety, at the expense of consumer safety. And they'll say things like, well, it threatens the model, it'll drive jobs out of New York City. And we've seen that debunked time and time again. I'm going to give you two quick examples. One was when we passed a few years ago, right before I got into the council, a bill that protected fast food workers, that gave them just cause protections. The employer had to have a valid reason for firing them and giving them notice. And the fast food industry was up in arms, and they said, you pass this bill, we're all going to leave New York City. There won't be fast food restaurants. And a year after the bill was implemented, we actually saw growth in the fast food industry, right? The sky didn't fall. And we've seen this from Amazon before, right? They have said, coming in when they tried to do Amazon HQ2 and wanted city subsidies, that they would leave, they'd take their jobs with them. And that didn't happen. They're still here. And Amazon is operating in this system where they don't care about the DSP owners, right? The case in point is the DSP owners who are left saddled with debt and are forced to choose between staying afloat and safety measures in the city. And this model, where again, we're getting $3 million packages a day in New York City, $1 billion this year, it hinges on the last mile facility, the deliverer, being close to the consumer. So they're not going anywhere. They're going to be here. And this is about, again, first and foremost, ensuring safety as that happens.
Here's another former delivery driver calling in, Lyndon in Brooklyn. You're on WNYC. Hello, Lyndon.
Yeah. Hello. Good morning to you all and your guests there. It's so true what she's saying, but one thing I think two things she missed is the number of packages that she said we deliver in New York City. You need to chunk that number up some more. It's more than that. I was a driver, and I used to do at least 160 stops in 8 hours. And the 160 stops considered sometimes 460 package.
Whoa.
And I probably was the least lowest of all. And it's a lot of pressure to do that. And second, with the contract companies such as the DSP, they have to look at the parking tickets too. I mean, the parking tickets is a lot because they don't want you double park, fire hydrant, et cetera, and it would happen. And, it's so right what you're saying. So right.
What's the solution as far as you're concerned, Lyndon? Is it just lower quotas and therefore less profit for the parent companies, or slower delivery for the consumers who can't necessarily expect everything in 24 hours or whatever?
Exactly. And it'd be less than 24 hours, like next day, within 4 hours. 4 hours, And the ones that do the non-cars, that drive the cars that, like the private cars, the ones, what you just call them just now, they do a lot of package too.
Yeah.
They do a lot of stuff too. At least, I would say, 80 to 90. That's probably equal to about 70 stops in a private vehicle.
Thank you very much, Lyndon, for helping us report this story. Call us again. And Councilmember, Amazon, let me give you a little bit of Amazon's pushback, because they organized a coalition called New York Delivers, and reportedly bust some of their subcontractors to City Hall to testify against the bill at your hearing, meaning some of these drivers don't want this kind of regulation. Does it tell us anything about the relationship between Amazon and these supposedly independent businesses?
Yeah, I mean, you said it yourself. The New York Delivers Coalition, it's backed by Amazon, and I actually the morning of the hearing, because a lot of the drivers didn't know who I was, and I was just coming by and saying hello before going to another rally, and said, hey, what are you doing here? And some of those drivers were just like, I got a text message or I got an email last night saying to come here, and they'd pay me for a full shift. So you had some folks who didn't know why they were there, and then you did have other folks from DSPs who, for a couple of DSPs, who did know why they were there, and they were supportive of their bosses. They said, hey, listen, I'm somebody who's worked really hard to get a job. I've had a really hard time finding a job, and I've got a job now. And all of those things are true. But again, we're seeing a model that is entirely unsustainable, right? And in terms of the conditions, you talked to the last caller about this, like what can we do to fix it? Well, a lot of this too is the subcontracting model where people, I didn't even mention this before, and he mentioned it, they're incentivized or have to violate traffic laws to be able to make their quota to keep their job. And then they get the tickets, and guess what? The tickets are coming out of their pay. That's Amazon should be paying those tickets. I mean, first of all, Amazon should be making sure that they are contracting and putting out work in a way where it doesn't require that sort of thing to happen. But the same thing with the vans that are falling apart and are in bad condition, the folks who don't have hand trucks and are dragging big packages and tearing up their body, every day in and out on the job. Jeff Bezos is buying yachts for his yachts. He can afford to maintain these vehicles and still turn in tremendous profit. And so again, this is about making that connection to make sure workers are safe and consumers and people who are just navigating their neighborhood every day safe. And they're going to need drivers and delivery folks to do that job. And it is a growing industry, and we'll continue to see that.
We've got 3 minutes left in the segment, and I want to use it to change the topic and just get your opinion generally of Mayor Mamdani in his first 100 days. People who know you, my guest is City Council Member Tiffany Caban from Queens, know that you're from an overlapping district.
That's right.
From where Mamdani was in the assembly, and very progressive, and you ran for Queens DA on a kind of progressive prosecutor label. So specifically on policing.
He was a field lead on that campaign.
Oh, on your campaign?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. He was cutting his teeth in politics on a Tiffany Caban campaign. So how's he doing on public safety and criminal justice, in your opinion? I know some people aren't happy that he reappointed Commissioner Tisch, or is allowing her to keep the so-called strategic response group in place, which he said he wanted disbanded on the campaign trail. So on that set of issues, how's he doing according to you?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing progress, right? I think, something that we have to also recognize is that we have leaned into a policing and public safety apparatus that took decades to build, and moving away from that is going to take time. And I am the unabashed abolitionist in the legislature, right? I want to see a world where we're building out the continuum of care, the infrastructure that really tackles public health issues rather than criminalizing them. And so I know that people were critical of him bringing on or keeping Jessica Tisch. I think the continuity made sense. And I sort of think on that appointment, damned if you do, damned if you don't. And we're seeing things where I'd like to see certain changes, and we'll continue to push for them, and seeing some places of really good headway. For example, I was really heartened by the fact that he has opened and started the Office of Community Safety. I have been someone who has been, deeply invested in Be Heard, alternative mental health responder model, our overdose prevention centers, all of these different things, and just see him really building out that infrastructure and saying, hey, we're going to incorporate this into the sort of the organizational structure of our city and have these agencies working together to treat mental health, substance use, poverty as the public health problems they are, rather than criminalize them, is a good thing that we will continue to work towards. And also, we're going to continue to put pressure on him to make sure that he keeps those promises that he made, whether it's the commitment to disband the strategic response group that we've seen cost the city millions of dollars in settlement fees, and how they are responding to people just out there exercising their constitutional right to assemble and protest. The same thing for the gang database. I want to see us do what we need to do on that front. It's a tightrope, rope to walk. And I'm also heartened by the appointment of Stanley Richards as the commissioner of the Department of Corrections. I don't wish that job on anybody. It is a really, really hard job. But if there's anybody that I think will go in there with integrity and who really understands the system and can reduce the harm, it's Stanley Richards. So I see areas that are great and areas where there's room for improvement.
And so, listeners, you know now, if you didn't know before, Mayor Mamdani gets pressure from the right on criminal justice, and he gets pressure from the left on criminal justice. Last question. For you as a member of City Council, there's been a lot of coverage recently of the relationship between the mayor and Council Speaker Julie Menin. Some have framed it as a feud already. From your point of view, is that what you're seeing?
It's budget season, and this is the mayor's first budget. Certainly not our first budget, but it's a tense time, right? The stakes are high. We have a gap that we need to fill, and this is part of the process. We're getting ready to sort of prep for the executive budget hearings. A lot depends on the state budget, so I think pressure is really, really high. There's going to be areas where there is sort of consensus. There's a shared commitment around universal 2K and 3K and strengthening that. And then there's going to be pushback against certain issues. And so I think it's pretty normal.
City Council Member Tiffany Caban, we always appreciate when you come on with us. Thanks for today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to Brian Lehrer Weekend. We're back on the radio Monday morning at 10 a.m. In the meantime, follow us on Blue Sky at The Brian Lehrer Show, where there's always a conversation 24/7.